Hello again. An awful lot of what people believe they know about both the slave trade and the history of racism is no more than a pack of fairy tales. This applies, by the way, just as much to the right wing as it does to the left. Many people who are opposed, for example, to the current obsession with the subject of the transatlantic slave trade and who reject the idea of reparations belong broadly to the right. When the subject of slavery cropped up, those people are very quick off the mark to point out that the Royal Navy patrolled the coast of Africa, discouraging the trade in slaves and rescuing slaves from ships which were trying to transport them to the Americas. Surely that means that Britain gets a bit of a bonus for carrying on in that way and suppressing the slave trade throughout the 19th century. Such people seldom give any thought to what actually happened to those slaves after the Navy had freed them. It's an interesting story and one which runs counter to much of what we think we know. Whenever the British abolition of slavery is mentioned, one name is sure to crop up, that of William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce was, of course, a British Member of Parliament who was instrumental in having the slave trade made illegal in the British Empire. Now, while it's true that Wilberforce, as part of his devout Christian belief, thought that slavery was wrong, that didn't mean that he felt that black people could run their own affairs or be freed wholesale without the outlook for such freed men, women and children being bleak and unpromising. In the late 18th century, Wilberforce and fellow members of his church, known as the Clapham Sect, some people here might have heard of the Clapham Sect, helped to found a colony in Africa which would be a refuge for former African slaves who had been repatriated to the continent from which they came. This was Sierra Leone. Even when the British government assumed nominal responsibility for Sierra Leone, as the colony was called, the Clapham sect was heavily involved in the running of the place. After the British abolition of the slave trade in 1807, the Royal Navy was active in intercepting ships in the Atlantic and around the coast of Africa, and if they were slavers, then returning the captives to Africa. Sierra Leone was a handy place to drop them because it was now run by the British and the Navy had a base there. In other words, even if the people that had been rescued from the slave ships came from somewhere like Benin or Dahomey, the Royal Navy would still dump them in Sierra Leone. It had a harbour, it had a naval base, it was a perfect place for them to put in and unload their cargo or the slaves that they'd rescued. William Wilberforce did not think that freeing slaves all at once was a good idea because they wouldn't be able to cope with freedom. He said that he and his fellow Christians, and I quote, had always thought the slaves incapable of liberty at present, but hoped that by degrees a change might take place as a natural result of the abolition. The slaves rescued by the Royal Navy were actually sold into slavery again in Sierra Leone. The governor there paid the Navy a bounty for each slave they deposited at the capital of the colony, Freetown. These people were then bound as apprentices, and I say that in inverted commas, for 14 years. Any who ran away were pursued, arrested and brought back to their masters. All this was sanctioned, arranged and organised by William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect. The first Crown Governor of Sierra Leone was called Thomas Perronnette Thompson, and he complained that Wilberforce and the Sierra Leone Company, which had founded the colony, and I quote, by means of their agents, become slave traders themselves. William Wilberforce didn't think that black people were able to take care of themselves and run their own affairs, which may come as something of a surprise to those who see him as some sort of early anti-racist. In much the same way, Abraham Lincoln is often seen as the man who fought a war to free black people, to free the slaves in the southern states. What did he think about black people? We cannot do better than look at what Abraham Lincoln said in a public debate in 1858, just 3 years before the beginning of the American Civil War. He said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favour of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor ever have been, in favour of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I, as much as any other man, am in favour of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Sounds like some kind of white supremacist, doesn't he? Abraham Lincoln was a believer in segregation and thought it would make life in the United States much easier if black people were all sent back to Africa. Both he and William Wilberforce were typical of progressive political thinkers of the 19th century. They might disapprove in theory of slavery or lynching, but that didn't mean that they viewed black people as their equals or indeed wanted to live next door to them. William Wilberforce and Abraham Lincoln are two of those whose work in ridding the world of slavery is often referred to. In the case of both men, the popular perception is very far from being the correct one. Neither Wilberforce nor Lincoln were advocates of equality, and neither of them thought that black people, cultural differences apart, shared the same potential or were possessed of the same intellectual abilities as white people. Both men were, in other words, racists. In the description to this video, I give references to support what I've been saying here.